The conference offers a full range of comment on endangered species in Ontario, and to that end, I'll offer a few remarks on the role of land trusts and, by extension, private landowners in general. I will comment on some of the trajectories of change over the last 40 years, and finally, I'll touch on species listing and one possible innovation. At the core of the Nature Conservancy's eco-regional assessments and its investments in lands and waters and its stewardship of sites is the accurate ranking of conservation needs of native species and habitats. NCC tracks species at risk at sites before acquiring them, builds its business plans around those species and habitats, and reports both internally and externally on the species at risk that are under its foster care. NCC now owns and manages more than 400,000 acres across Canada. The lands it has secured in the past 5 years alone support the habitats of 146 species at risk at multiple locations. NCC spent $16 million on land stewardship last year. These are not lands that NCC acquired by accident, but for their biodiversity, and therefore the competence, the health, and the stability of the endangered species programs is of particular concern to NCC, as it is to all affected landowners and land managers. Experience shows us that NCC has to consider the range of approaches to species ranking. So, for example, over 50% of NCC projects in Saskatchewan support Sprague's pipit, which COSEWIC lists as a threatened species. NatureServe, the North American Conservation Data Center Network, ranks it as a G4, globally apparently secure. And the Saskatchewan CDC ranks it as an S4, which is subnationally apparently secure. Sprague's pipit shares these contradictory ranks with Ontario's bobolink. However, Sprague's pipit is not protected under the Saskatchewan Wildlife Act, which protects species at risk in Saskatchewan. So multiply these differences in advisory ranks by the number of COSEWIC species, 668, as regulated under 10 provincial and 1 federal regulatory regime, and consider the challenges. In response, NCC uses whatever species rankings are available to it, and then considers whether species and habitats should be considered irreplaceable or not. This concept has been useful in conservation planning, in Marksan runs, for example, and in site stewardship. Irreplaceable might be something like G3 or S3 species, for example, globally or subnationally vulnerable. Now, a parallel regulatory regime is emerging across Canada right now. Species at risk programs and fishery programs to begin with, are developing biodiversity offset programs that permit compensatory offsets where legally required avoidance and mitigation has not dealt with impacts appropriately or fully. In going this route, government agencies are looking to new tools, but they are also looking to downsize and to outsource responsibilities. Corporations see this as a new means, legitimized by agencies, to meet their environmental corporate responsibilities. Both government and business envisage that the delivery of offsets could be through private conservation banks, a la California, or non-government organizations. In such transactions, non-government conservation organizations are at risk of accusations of complicit behavior, greenwash, notwithstanding the merits of particular transactions. The Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans is well down this road. Species risk programs are testing this approach across the country, and Ontario is well down that path. Much of this is brought on by budgetary constraints, but also in response to the listing of species as species of risk that are so widespread that impacts are unavoidable. I'll return to this later. NCC has been in the voluntary offset business for 50 years in response to donor interests in offsetting any number of legal activities, many of them totally unrelated to environmental impacts. And we call them biodiversity benefits, like M&R calls them overall benefits, rather than offsets. And we argue that such transactions must result in significant net benefits for biodiversity. Even industry representatives now agree that the old saw of no net loss does not achieve what is needed or expected. NCC has drafted rules of engagement to guide its involvement in such offset transactions based on internationally developed criteria, most importantly to define what NCC considers to be the limits to what it will offset. When agencies and corporations are in agreement in support of a new offset regime, it will remain to others, in this case to NGOs, to set their own limits. At present, NCC is relying on its core practice of distinguishing those species and habitats and natural processes that are irreplaceable, which it doesn't consider offsettable, from those that are less irreplaceable or replaceable. But where do we draw the line? What species should be subject to offsets? So what has been the overall trajectory of change in 40 years? There has been heightened awareness of species at risk and an avoidance and mitigation of countless negative impacts to those species. This is good. The price that has been paid has included more legally required plans and reviews, more legal and consulting fees, more process, more listings of less at-risk species, more permits issued for impacts, and still, arguably, no adequate assistance to landowners or land managers through advice, tax relief, or other means. As we've heard, Ontario was second jurisdiction in North America to pass endangered species legislation in 1971. I recall a group of us here would invite Irene Bowman, the ministry's only staff person for many years, to cross Queen's Park from the Whitney Block to suffer an annual grilling on her work. Mark? Yes, oh, there you are. I think about 6 or 8 species were then under the regulations, and we had candidates to suggest. At the time, a species had to be extremely rare or preferably extirpated to be regulated, and the standard reason given for limiting the listing of species was that we did not know enough about the species. So it's a little more historic look at this. In part in response, this was also the period when Ontario and Canada's first rare species data atlases were started, all of them voluntary. They were spatially explicit for the first time and laid down the foundations for the Natural Heritage Information Centre, or NHIC in Ontario, which became the biodiversity database for Ontario. As I alluded to before, the NHIC assigns North American-style conservation ranks to Ontario's native species, which are then rolled up nationally and internationally into NatureServe conservation ranks. So by 1997, an article in Seasons magazine would list 129 species at risk, all of them listed, but not all regulated, of course, and with all of the endangered and threatened species still real rarities. To stay with the theme of rarity, I'll mention that the same article would note that more than 400 native species occurring in Ontario at the time were known at 5 or fewer locations. So by NatureServe ranks, these would be S1 species, critically imperiled. But progress was certainly being made by then. In the 1990s, I served on the Plants Subcommittee of COSEWIC, reviewing status reports and recommending ranks. This was the time period where major changes occurred to how species were designated by COSEWIC. I call this a period of definition creep, away from a focus on endangered species at imminent risk to a more general focus on species in decline, which is not the same thing. The Ontario Endangered Species Act and the Canada Species at Risk Act use the same definitions of endangerment, which is facing imminent extirpation or extinction. They do not, however, share the same definitions of what imminent means. To the broader public, imminent means likely to happen soon, in a short time. All things being equal, and speaking very generally here, rare species are at more imminent risk of extinction or extirpation. COSEWIC decided in the 1990s, and against the advice of some, to change its under-the-hood definitions for species at risk. They chose the approach taken by the IUCN rather than that used by NatureServe. And although the NatureServe and IUCN approaches are generally crosswalkable, they differ in that NatureServe lays more emphasis on the rarity of species, while the IUCN lays more emphasis on the decline of species. IUCN Red List categories first appeared as numerical criteria only in 1992. Their criteria dealt with the threat of extinction, species extinction, however, not that of regional species extirpation. The application of criteria designed around extinction to matters of regional extirpation was a shift in definition. Also, in adopting IUCN criteria, COSEWIC dropped the word imminent. It replaced it with quantitative temporal criteria. For example, COSEWIC adopted the IUCN definition of endangered as the probability of extirpation or extinction greater than 20% in 20 years or 5 generations. For threatened species, however, COSEWIC adopted the IUCN's criteria for vulnerable species, which is a 100-year time horizon. This was a little further shift in definition. Now, I must add, however, that beyond these numerical criteria, which are many, COSEWIC also takes the opportunity for a more general, sober second thought after all the calculations have been made. In Ontario, COSARO's criteria has no definition of imminent. Where did imminent go? The MNR Species at Risk website now excludes the word imminent from its summary definitions. You may have noted that Mark's PowerPoint presentation this morning left imminent out of the definition of endangered. Without changing the legal definition of endangered, we have refocused the program over 40 years from species at imminent risk of extinction or extirpation to a broader program dealing with declining species at eventual risk of reduced population levels over longer periods of time. To bring the Sprague's pipit example closer to home, bobolink is not rare in Ontario and has no probability of imminent extirpation. It is ranked by NatureServe as globally secure, and in Ontario as S4, or subnationally apparently secure. Now, I apologize. This is the level of detail that people normally pay actuarial accountants for. I subject you to it to make a point, and that is that every part of the Endangered Species Program warrants innovation, including the designation of species based on the experiences learned. So the listing of more abundant species has real outcomes. Much more landowner assistance and advice is required. Additional effort has to be put to stemming the erosion of perceived erosion of credibility in the program. More importantly, it pushes us back towards species-focused wildlife management when we know that multiple species approaches at broader landscape scales must be pursued. So how do we deal with 200 plus species at risk, as well as the hundreds of other species that are, based purely on rarity, at even higher risks of extirpation, at sites where many of them occur together and where their habitat needs are at odds with each other? In emergency wards, we call this triage. Even when the caregiver, in this case the land manager, wants to do right by all the patients. Innovations is one of the goals of the conference. Let me table one way to think about this matter of definition creep, and one that re-emphasizes the word imminent. Without changing the definitions in law, which would surely bring down hellfire, or amending COSEWIC practices, which are near sacred, Ontario's COSARO could revive the concept of imminent in its deliberations. And on that basis, and relying on complementary rankings such as those by NatureServe, Ontario could distinguish between species at risk that are irreplaceable, S1 to S3 species perhaps, relegating the remainder to a temporary watch list, a watch list that makes them subject of increased studies before they are determined to be at imminent risk, which raises so much legal implications in the minds of land managers and landowners. Again, this would be an opportunity for sober second thought. Now, for the Nature Conservancy, a secondary benefit to this approach would be to temper the current enthusiasm by both agencies and developers for regulated biodiversity offset programs or benefit programs. Species at imminent risk and thus irreplaceable could continue to require outright avoidance, while those on the watch list could be considered for other possible offsets. So beyond this, Ontario needs some real enhancement of its land and water management programs in general to better address the environmental challenges of hard-working landscapes, including such matters as the enhancement of habitat for species in decline, protection of water systems for sure, and conservation of areas of outstanding biodiversity and ecosystem services. Naturally, this is what I read into M&R's new broader landscape approach, which has been tabled to modernize Ontario's natural resource management. So thank you very much. Have a great conference.